Good afternoon, everyone. While we're waiting for folks to sign on, feel free to put your name and organization in the chat. We'll wait another 30 seconds or so before we actually get started. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar on From Classroom to Careers, the Path to a First Job, jointly sponsored by the 74 and the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm Bruno Mano, Senior Advisor at PPI, working on both K-12 issues and workforce education and training issues. Our goal today is to explore what it takes to ensure that every young person leaves K-12 or college, not just with credentials, but with momentum, a launch pad into meaningful work. We'll look at how data, policy, and practice can better align to ensure every young person leaves school with a viable pathway into meaningful work. And we have three guests with us. I'll do a brief introduction, and then we'll get into the conversation. Carlos Salerno is Managing Director of Education Insights with the Burning Glass Institute. Preston Cooper is Senior Fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. And Jenny Niles is President and CEO of CityWorks DC. Carlos and I will start off the conversation with a Q&A back and forth that'll last maybe 10, 15 minutes. And then we'll go into a panel discussion with Preston and Jenny and myself, and then bring Carlo into the conversation at some point. Looking at this topic, From Classroom to Careers, the path to a first job, from a variety of different perspectives. Carlo will help us understand the challenges associated with the changing first job landscape. Preston will help us understand how some of the current higher education landscape is changing. And then Jenny will help us look at this through the eyes of a local organization that promotes apprenticeships and other forms of work-based learning. So that's the agenda for today. Let's begin then with a conversation between Carlo and myself. Carlo, tell folks a little bit about your background and how you came to this issue. I introduced you quickly as Managing Director of Educational Insights with the Burning Glass Institute, but tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to the issue.
Yeah, sure, Bruno. Thanks for having me. Again, my name is Carlo Salerno. I have worked in the post-secondary education space for the better part of 25 years now. Worn a lot of hats over the years. Before working at Burning Glass, I worked for an ed tech company called Campus Logic. Before that, I was with Strata Education Network. Before that, I had spent time working with the U.S. Government Accountability Office on higher education issues. Had my own startup doing education analytics work, and so over my career, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the challenges of how to get people into college, through college, and successfully into the labor market afterwards. And so today at the Burning Glass Institute, I spearhead and lead the part of our portfolio that is focused on the education side of the education to workforce bridge. We spend a lot of time at this institute thinking about the alignment between what is taught and what is sought. And so we spend our days working with schools and school systems and foundations and state government organizations to try and understand how can we take how can we take big data and thoughtfully understand how people are taking college degrees and certifications that they're currently obtaining and using them in the workforce.
Yeah, and I'm going to refer to a couple of reports that Burning Glass has put out over the last few months and ask you to talk about them. And they deal both with what I would call the sort of non-college degree pathway as well as the college degree pathway. And we're going to talk about both of those over the course of the next hour or so. But a recent report by you called Launchpad Jobs looks at the non-college degree pathway. So let's start with that one. What is a launchpad job, and how do we distinguish between a job that puts you on a pathway to upward mobility and one which may not be as good when it comes to launching you into a career?
Great question, and you partially answered it for me, Bruno, because part of it is one of the things that we do think about is, what are the jobs that move you up in a career? But when we did this report, we were trying to tackle the challenge of, look, almost a third of high school graduates do not go to college immediately after high school, and while college students get a lot of guidance around how to prepare for their future and how to invest in a future, what we were observing is that there were large swaths of the 18 to 22-year-old spectrum who had no sense of what to do if they chose not to immediately go into post-secondary education. And so we started digging into the data. We tried to understand sort of the landscape. We found that the top 20% of all high school only earners out earn the median college grad. So we know that there are earning gains to be had from not going to college. We also know that there are a lot of jobs that start out at $25,000 a year. And we know that a lot of people who are in those jobs can have wildly different earnings 10, 15, 20 years later. And so what we did is we started to unpack all of the different factors that we thought were relevant to figuring out how do you flywheel somebody who decides not to initially go to college into the workforce under the assumption that they may at some point choose to go back and get some kind of post-secondary training. And so we started looking at things like wages and wage growth, and we started looking at things like where were people finding initial unemployment, but then tracking and experiencing promotion and wage potentials or wage growth simultaneously. Where were they able to find non-pecuniary benefits like health insurance? Where were the jobs that were going to be more robustly protected against risk of AI automation? And so we sort of put all of these things kind of into a blender, right? And on the back end, we came up with around 75 some jobs that had higher than average earnings out the gate, had promotion potential, offered some great protections that, could help somebody build a career around, and, use that to sort of start to understand what does this landscape look like.
Yeah, I know in the report you get specific. Maybe mention a job or two here that one that is a launch pad and one that, even though you're at the same starting point, might not be quite as much of a launch pad.
Yeah, I mean, again, like things like paramedics, EMTs, health technologists, surgical technologists, electricians, telecom installers. There's a lot of jobs. Some of them are very apprenticeship oriented or very manufacturing oriented. Others, again, are very strongly geared towards jobs that are, people do with their hands, for lack of a better term, right? So there's a wide array of jobs out there. And again, these jobs also have lots of opportunity. These are jobs that have lots of job openings available as well, too. And so, we're trying to consider a gamut of things. I think commercial divers is on the list, which probably will be less relevant to the folks in Nebraska, but maybe more relevant to people in Massachusetts and, New Jersey, for example, or even California. So there's a little of something for everybody, but I think what we were trying to do was again, break some myths and give high school students and folks not thinking about the college path a sense of what does good look like beyond just a good first salary.
And to kind of transition over to the college pathway, um, your the report that Burning Glass produced has an interesting title to it. It was called "No Country for Young Grads," which is a kind of ominous way of describing the situation. What was the gist of the analysis there, and how the country is not necessarily a place for young grads at the moment?
Well, again, a great question, and looking forward to Preston and Jenny's take on this as well, obviously, as we get further in. But I mean, we have long been taught that a bachelor's degree is the ticket to economic mobility and prosperity, and we have reached arguably a very unique inflection point where what we're seeing is uh, college graduates suddenly finding themselves on the higher end of the relative unemployment scale than than other degree holders. We are seeing concepts like AI starting to automate away a lot of the entry level work that was previously filled by a lot of college or entry level college grads. There's a number of dynamics, some of which I think are unique to the time period that we live in. Some are unique to the policy environment that we're operating under today. Some are unique to just the changing demographics of who's in the workforce. But what we were trying to capture there is this sort of reality that, look, the way work is unfolding is changing, and the way we train and prepare workers for that has to change as well too. And while bachelor's degrees will continue to remain to be great educational investments, there are different aspects of the learning environment that we're going to want to think about as we go forward, including shorter term credentials, including, thinking about the kinds of roles we want people to roll into, and thinking about, again, where AI can either help folks be better at a job or where AI can, take jobs off the table that require less training so that we can move folks who are doing those jobs into other high value positions.
Yeah, you brought up two issues that I did want to pursue. Let's do one at a time here rather than go for both of them at once. So let's, if you prefer to tackle both of them at once, that's fine. But it's the
Whatever you'd
question
like.
of credentials, micro credentials, and then AI. So from your analysis, what is the impact that AI has on these differing pathways, the non-college pathways opposed to the college pathway? Is there a differential there? Is it affecting it in different ways from the kind of analytics that Burning Glass uses to look at these issues?
I mean, again, I think the answer is yes. And there's a lot of a good way to think about it is maybe to consider it less something that's degree driven and more something that's just sort of skill driven, right? If you sort of think about the kinds of things that you think about the kinds of things that are likely to be automated away by AI, it's things like copywriting and editing. It's things like project management and business management tools where there's some ability to sort of augment what's there, but like mostly, we like to think of AI today as a high energy intern, right? Like think of the things that a high energy intern would typically do, and that kind of gives you a sense of like where the AI is kind of headed. There's tasks, whether they be writing or communication, that again, we don't necessarily need to have a human to do, but we oftentimes want a human to check, and we want a human to augment and expand around. And so, a lot of this is one of the reasons why when you start looking at the launchpad jobs, for example, what you see is a lot of the jobs that are protected from AI are jobs where a robot, I say robot, flippantly, like, it's harder for a robot to step in and do the work, especially think about paramedics at the moment, for example. Think about firefighting. Think about, line installers, right? Like these are difficult jobs for technology to automate. Whereas, copy editing again is a great example of something where, AI has become very good at delivering baseline content and providing core content, writing emails, communicating with clients. There's a lot of things that those technologies can do. And so as we start to think about where those skills sit, some of those sit in business schools and in traditional degrees, but some of those also sit at the K-12 level as well. And some of those things don't sit in any training program at all. They almost become life skills in some sense. So
Yeah, I guess the euphemism here is skills is the new currency. Is that the way of talking about some of this stuff?
I think that's right. I think that's fair. I like to think of and I'm no biologist, and I'm, but I like to think of credentials as sort of atoms, and I think of skills as the molecules that that the atoms are built around. You know what I mean? And so as you keep breaking down further and further, skills are like those fundamental building blocks of the kinds of credentials that we value and care about. And so, for me, I like to think about what those core components are. Can I give a quick anecdote, Bruno?
Of course.
So my daughter is had worked for Hilton. She's a college student today, and she had worked a front desk job at Hilton, and customer service and the like. And she moved, and she was reluctant to put the job on her resume because she felt like it was an entry level nondescript position. And after a conversation where we started to unpack all the skills she'd learned, whether they were customer service or whether they were being in a corporate environment or being, any number of tactical value components to this front end job, she was able to immediately parlay that into getting a job with a country club. Because a country club in the city that she had moved to valued all of those corporate communication experience skills that she had accumulated far more than the job itself. And so I think, again, as we sort of think about skills versus credentials, there's a place for both, but those things have their place in different contexts. And there's a lot of possibility and there's a lot of opportunity for people who, again, going back to the front report, either don't go to college originally or may go to college later to sort of learn and accumulate skills that have currency that can allow people to build successful careers.
Yeah, and one final question to you before we transition over to
Sure.
Preston and Jenny. Talk a little bit about this credentials issue, non-degree credentials, micro credentials, all the things that go under that sort of broad umbrella, and the value of them and validating them and finding out whether they're of any value.
Yeah, again, great question. We've done some work. We have something called our Credentials of Value Index. We have tried to get into this explosive field of non-degree, short form industry credentials and really start to unpack what's there because they're there and there's a lot of them and they're growing and it's really hard for a discerning consumer to sort of look and understand, well, which ones are useful, which ones are valuable. So and again, like if you think about the short form industry credentials, that market is often not tapped by the traditional 18 to 22-year-old who is thinking about a core bachelor's degree and thinking about a long-term investment in their future. These are adults. These are late 20s, mid 30s, early 40s individuals who have jobs, who have careers, who may be looking for upskilling or to transition because they're trying to solve an immediate economic concern or try to boost their immediate economic prospects. And so when they're out there searching through tens of thousands of credentials being offered by, dozens of different firms where they may have casually heard those names or not, being able to sort of develop some standardization, some way for them to determine whether or not a credential is good or a credential from any given provider is good is hard. And so this is what we've tried to do. And essentially, we very quickly, we went through about 24,000 of these credentials. Which covers a large expanse of the space that most people think about. And we found about roughly 3,300 of them, were credentials where when you took everything into account, including the counterfactual of people who looked just like those credential holders, but didn't have that credential, there were about 3,300 that delivered some kind of economic return. And so it's very easy to say, oh, goodness, that's a very small fraction of these industry credentials. At the same time, that means that there's still thousands of them that do provide currency. And I think it's worth talking about that sense of which ones do provide currency and why they provide currency.
Yeah, and it's available online, and I've
That's
gone
right.
online and played with it a bit. It's very user-friendly and has a bunch of categories that you can access and cross-reference and so on and so forth. So it is a real tool that people
Thank you.
can use. And my recollection is that you can do this, you can look at jobs regionally.
Correct.
There are a variety of ways to do it. So encourage people to look at that if they haven't seen it. Let's transition over to Preston and Jenny, and Carla will bring you back in a little bit later. But to come at this question from a couple of different angles, Preston, introduce yourselves to folks other than the kind of brief introduction I gave, and then I'll tee it up for a question. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Preston Cooper. I'm a senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, focusing on higher education policy. I want to thank you, Bruno, and the Progressive Policy Institute for bringing me in for this conversation. I'm very excited to hear more from my fellow panelists here.
Right, and Jenny, a quick intro. I gave the one-liner, but just so folks have a little bit more on your background. You've been involved in K-12 stuff for quite a while in a variety of different ways.
He's saying that so gently. Yes, Bruno and I have known each other for a long time. I am currently president and CEO of CityWorks DC. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But before that, I founded and ran a public charter school here in DC called E.L. Haynes Public Charter School, and also served as our deputy mayor for education for the city of DC, which includes not just the K-12, but also higher ed, libraries, parks and rec, and our state education agency and others.
Good. All right. So let's get into a couple of questions here. Preston, you wrote an interesting piece recently that's had a few different iterations, but the sort of working title that caught my interest was "Learning with Their Feet." Students are learning with their feet. What does that mean, practically speaking? Because it involves looking at higher ed, of course, but enrollment trends in higher ed and people making decisions about what might be a valuable credential as opposed to one which is maybe not as valuable. Tell us a little bit about that analysis.
For sure. It's actually funny about that title. When that report was published, a friend of mine texted me and said, Preston, I love your new report, but the title is very gross. So I probably should have chosen a different title. But Learning with Their Feet, the reason I chose that title is that I think we don't always appreciate the importance of consumer choice in shaping the higher education sector, in shaping, how colleges and universities are faring. And so the kind of point of that report is we have seen a 20% decline in undergraduate college enrollment since 2010. 2010 was kind of the peak of college enrollment right after the Great Recession, but ever since then, it's been mostly declining. It's coming back a little bit right now. And so the question I ask in the report is which types of schools are actually losing students? Because that decline in enrollment isn't happening equally across the board. And so in the report, we divide colleges up into 5 groups or quintiles based on their student outcomes. So we look at outcomes like what percentage of your students are you graduating? What percentage of your students are repaying their student loans on time? And what are your former students earning after they go out into the labor force? And those outcomes differ a lot across different institutions. And we found that the institutions with really poor student outcomes, so the schools where most students aren't graduating, where people are buried in debt they can't repay, and where people are not earning any more than a typical high school graduate, those schools have lost almost half of their enrollment since 2010. So almost all of the decline in college enrollment since 2010 is concentrated at these lower quality schools. And it turns out colleges of higher quality, the colleges where most students are graduating, where people have an easier time repaying their loans and where earnings after graduation are a lot higher, these colleges are really holding their own. You know, they're seeing enrollment hold steady, and in many cases, they're seeing enrollment increase. And so I think it's really important, you know, when we're thinking about college enrollment trends and, you know, students changing relationship to college, the big takeaway, I think, is that students are learning with their feet by making better choices about which institutions to attend. Students are seeking that value from higher education. They want to make sure they're graduating. They want to make sure they're able to repay their student loans. They want to make sure they're going to get a good job after graduation that's going to enable them to reach the middle class. And colleges which are delivering on that promise are doing well. They are thriving in this new environment. They are increasing their enrollment. But colleges which are failing students, which are not delivering on that promise, they are seeing their enrollment slide. And I predict they will continue to see their enrollment slide until they get their outcomes into better shape.
And these institutions are not just the so-called elites of the field. There are a lot of publics. Talk a little bit more specifically about characteristics of these institutions.
Absolutely. So if we look at the highest quality institutions out there, so, you know, the schools that are really gaining enrollment, it's not necessarily, you know, the Ivy Leagues. It's a lot of public four-year universities that are often a lot of state flagships, some regional four-year universities that enroll lots of students and actually do a pretty good job with serving them. So for instance, my institution where I got my PhD, George Mason University, they are what Carnegie classifies as a high access, high outcomes institution. So they have a very high acceptance rate. They accept most students who apply, but they also do very well serving them. They are placing those students into good paying jobs. They are graduating them at relatively high rates. And schools like George Mason are doing extremely well. George Mason has seen a very large double-digit increase in enrollment over the last 10 years or so. They're now, you know, about 40,000 students. And so it's really those big public four years that are doing a good job with their students that are thriving in this new environment. The same can't be said for a lot of schools where the outcomes really aren't as good. So a lot of proprietary colleges and also a lot of community colleges as well, where the graduation rates are kind of low. Those are the schools that are disproportionately losing enrollment because I think students have gotten the sense that if they attend one of these institutions, they're not necessarily going to get a good deal.
And can two other questions, and then we'll go to Jenny. Can you generalize at all about the fields that are sort of hot fields and that return the value here? And I'll have one other question after that one.
Absolutely. So in addition to making different choices about which college they attend, we also find that students are making different choices about what they study once they arrive on campus. There have been huge shifts in the composition of college majors over the last 15 years or so. And what we find is that high-wage college majors, so, you know, majors which tend to get students into jobs where they earn a high salary after graduation, are really seeing huge increases in enrollment. So majors like engineering, nursing, computer science, economics, even business and political science are tending to see fairly substantial increases in degree conferrals, increases in the number of students pursuing and earning degrees in those fields of study. But unfortunately, you know, majors which do not produce quite as good an economic return on investment are seeing the number of students choosing to pursue those fields decline. So English literature, for instance, has faced nearly a 40% decline in the number of degrees conferred. The same is true for history, for sociology, and other social sciences. That's not to say that, you know, there's no inherent value to those fields, but I think students look at the job opportunities that they have after graduation if they do earn a degree in one of those fields, and they say, well, I'm not sure that it's really worth it to pursue this major because I'm not confident I'm going to be able to get a good paying job after graduation and reach the middle class. So in addition to, you know, choosing different types of schools, I think students are becoming more sensitive to what their economic outcomes are going to be after graduation and making different choices about which subjects to study.
Yeah, I said one more question, but let me put a footnote to what you were just saying with a quick question and maybe a quick answer. What about the humanities and all that? Are there growth fields in the humanities, so to speak?
Yeah, so unfortunately, you know, a lot of the humanities are not doing great. I mean, we are seeing declines in enrollment in a lot of those fields. There are a few social science fields where there are you know, increases in enrollment. Psychology is one. But unfortunately, you know, that people are not choosing these fields in as great a numbers. And I think that this really holds a lesson for colleges. It's not necessarily that you should give up on these fields entirely, but you should try to figure out ways to make these fields a better deal for students. So if you have an English program, for instance, think about the types of jobs that an English major might thrive in. Are there ways you can change the curriculum to better prepare students for those jobs? I know Burning Glass has done some excellent work on this, about looking at the particular skills you can attach to different majors and figuring out, how to change the curriculum in order to produce better earnings outcomes for graduates. Internships are another, key factor that has an impact on your earnings potential after graduation. Burning Glass, again, has done some great work on this. You can tell I say Burning Glass a lot. If you have a internship under your belt before you graduate college, your likelihood of being employed in a higher wage, college appropriate job is much, much higher. So there are things colleges can do to make the humanities a better deal for students. But I think the conclusion from my research is that they can't just persist with business as usual and expect everything to be fine. They really do have to proactively make changes to the way they're teaching to these subjects, to the way that they're preparing students for their future careers, to the way they're preparing students for the labor force, if they want to survive and thrive in this new era for higher education.
You've helped me transition over to Jenny, and I was going to do that with a question. So I'll ask the direct question and then we'll go to Jenny. You wrote an interesting short piece on apprenticeships, and a Nobel economist who studied this issue in England. So almost as a way of giving a little historical context and then transitioning over to Jenny, talk about that essay you wrote and the importance of it.
Absolutely. So Joel Mokyr just won the Nobel Prize in economics a few weeks ago. He is a brilliant man, has done a lot of research on the causes of the Industrial Revolution and just scientific, technological, and economic progress more broadly. And what I highlighted in my piece for the American Enterprise Institute, which you're referencing, is that he really highlighted the key role of apprenticeships in generating the great growth miracle we saw during the Industrial Revolution. He has a bunch of papers, linking apprenticeships to all of these great economic outcomes. But the kind of transmission mechanism that he identified is that it's not necessarily that, apprentices are going to be super widespread in the labor force, and this is the way that, all jobs are trained for, but that apprentices can have a key role in what he calls kind of upper tail human capital. So they're the people who can be the skilled tradesmen who help figure out new improvements to different types of machines that are then, generating great increases in productivity. So, Richard Arkwright invents the water frame, but then legions of apprentices kind of figure out how to make that better and adapt that to new contexts. And you have this kind of continuous culture of innovation and productivity growth that is engendered by the apprenticeship system, which enabled, England during the Industrial Revolution, not just to grow once and that was it, but to also, sustain that growth for a long period of time, indeed, right up to the modern day. And so I think the takeaway from this essay is that, apprenticeship is a great way to train students for jobs in the new economy, because when you're working on the job, you are learning more about just how everything related to your job operates, and you can figure out ways to improve the way your company is doing things, and you can figure out those new little micro innovations in order to create more productivity, more economic growth that will benefit not only you and your firm, but will benefit the economy more broadly. So big fan of apprenticeships, and I'm glad to see that the Nobel Committee recognized that.
Perfect transition now over to Jenny and the work that she does here in DC. You've generally described what you're up to at CityWorks, but talk a little bit more about your approach to work-based learning, who you work with here in the city, employers and schools, and so on, to give people a sense of how this all practically can play out.
No, I appreciate that. Thanks, Bruno. I mean, so one of the projects that CityWorks does is we lead the CareerWise DC program or project, and that we're an affiliate with a modern youth apprenticeship program called CareerWise, and we execute that in DC. The distinctions or the nuances about being a modern youth apprenticeship program are a couple-fold. One is it's starting in high school, typically. It's in IT, business operations, finance, healthcare. So it's not in the skilled trades, which is where most Americans think apprenticeship. And most apprentices are 29-year-olds, not young people. And I think the other piece is that they are intense. So they're 2,000 hours of on-the-job learning, just as Preston was indicating, and they combine both classroom learning and on-the-job learning. And so I think that the thing that I want to sort of enter into this conversation is not college or career, but it's actually for our kids in DC. Every student is working during college. Even all of our college-bound students are working. The question is whether they're having a career-building job while they're in college or not. And so when Preston mentioned, when a young person is competing for a good job in DC, they not only need to have the right credential and or degree, but they need social capital, and they also need the work experience that if you had internships, you can put on your resume about that Carlo mentioned that his daughter had. And so part of this is thinking about how we create career building opportunities for young people, both in high school, but also as part of what their career path looks like. And for us, most of our apprentices also either go to college or work full-time and go to part-time. So it's actually not an either or for them at all. It's an and both. And it's figuring out how to navigate what it means to support themselves during college. And they often need a job and expertise that they can not only work in retail and food service.
Give us a practical example of an institution here in DC that you work with, both employer as well as educational institution, and how you bring them together, and a little bit more about who pays for what and how does it work in practice?
So I'll give an example of, we work with Accenture as an employer, and Accenture pays the wages of the young person for the 2,000 hours of training and provides the classroom training that goes with it. What we do is work with high schools, especially that have career and technical education programs that align with what occupations Accenture is seeking to build skills in. So if it's an IT job, or if it's a business operations, or if it's a finance job. And then we help the Accenture hire the young people. And then we support the young people throughout their time at Accenture, and talk to both the supervisors as well as the young people, and then form that bridge. Because one of the things that's really obvious is that this is often the young person's first example of being in a workplace. And so navigating all of those those dynamics and the applied learning that's going along with them. What's fantastic, though, is that the transformative power of giving young people opportunities to practice and build employability skills, sort of at bats of these core things, is just really exciting. And the agency with which they understand what they're good at and what they're capable of, and being able to advocate for themselves, is invaluable. And you may learn some of that in college, but it's definitely a different opportunity to have applied learning. And that's the piece I think that we're missing in the US in particular, is like, how do we have more opportunities for applied learning for young people so that they are set up to have those three things that they need for an entry-level job.
There are sort of a jargon in this space is apprenticeship intermediaries. Do you think of yourself as an intermediary of some type? You're the go-between, but what's the euphemism you would use to describe what you do?
I appreciate that question. We are definitely a work-based learning intermediary when it comes to the apprenticeship work. We also, though, do strategic planning and work with, for instance, the state of Maryland. And we also helped the District of Columbia start its new education through employment data system, because there wasn't a way for us to actually measure the early career outcomes of our young people. And I think that you heard from Carlos and Preston, like the importance of, it's not just whether you went to college or not, it's actually what job do you have, how much are you earning, what's your trajectory. And so if we can, as educators, both in high school and post-high school, if we can know what's happening for a 24, 25, 26-year-old? Are they on a path to trajectory? And that the article about what are important first jobs, it really makes a huge difference if you start out what trajectory you're on. So I would call it a work-based learning intermediary, but then we also do these other pieces that sometimes could be called other functionalities like strategic planning.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because people sometimes get roped into thinking about the work of an intermediary in too narrow a focus. I mean, you do the go-between work, you do the strategy work, you do the sort of data work. There are a lot of ways to think about different roles that these intermediaries can play. I'm going to say something to all three of you now, and then I'll probably go back to Jenny with a question while you think about this. I'm going to ask each of you to think of a question you want to ask somebody else in the conversation here. So I'll give you a minute or two to think about that, and go back to Jenny. And I won't start with Jenny since she's talking. I'll probably go to Carlo first, and then Preston and Jenny. So in the work that you do, give us some sense of what a day or a week would look like in the life of a student who is involved in this. And I use the word student in a broad sense of the word. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take a young man who graduated from one of our public high schools in DC. He started with Accenture when he was a senior and worked from 12 to 16 hours a week for that first year. He graduated from high school. He knew that he actually did not want to go to college, but knew that he wanted to be working. And so he continued with Accenture, working part-time for the second year, and then went full-time for his third year. And now is a product developer full-time at Accenture, and earning great money. You know, like it's a dream story for him. And he will often credit this lucky moment where one of his advisors said, "Hey, will you come listen to a webinar about CareerWise and apprenticeship?" And he was somebody who knew that college wasn't the way he thought that he would thrive. And so that this was just a remarkable opportunity. And how many more young people like him wish that there were things like that. I'll just add another one, a different student at one of our charter high schools who was in the Career Academy for Finance. She was hired by Freddie Mac for their supply chain management division. She started working there 12 to 16 hours when she was a senior. She continued after by enrolling full-time in college, but she did that at a college that allowed her to continue to work full-time. So she worked full-time for Freddie Mac for the next 2 years while she was finishing her apprenticeship. And through that, figured out that while finance was something she was interested in, what she really cared about was people and HR. And so she describes having shifted her majors in college directly because of the experience she was having at Freddie Mac. And she's described to me how, the accounting professor would say, "And we're going to do this now." And she's like, "Yeah, I did that last year." So her work experience outstripped what she was learning in college, but really helped her make the decisions that she needed to, really informed her decision. And she will be finishing her BA this December. And she has also figured out that what she wants to do is work with young people and help them with career counseling, with career coaching, and making sure that young people have the information that Preston and Carlo have talked about what is the return on investment for specific colleges? What are the pieces of the puzzle that they need to put together for their specific, their pathway to a great career?
Okay, let's do panel question here. Carlos, starting with you. Do you have a question you want to pitch to either Preston or Jenny?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the question I have is for Preston. My question is for Preston, and it is how do we resolve institutions that may look like they're underperforming, but have programs that outperform? Should an institution that in general underperforms but has select programs outperform? How do you handle that? How could we handle that? Right? Not, good schools will have bad performing programs, and bad schools, I use these in quotes, will have good performing programs. How do we reconcile that mix within a school?
That's a great question. I totally agree. You're absolutely right that, a lot of the value of college doesn't necessarily come down to the institution, although the institution certainly matters, but there still is a lot of variation within institutions because there are some very high quality programs and there are some programs that really don't perform that well. And that's why, when I try to give students advice about the college pathway, everybody wants to focus on which college am I going to, which college am I going to, what is at the top of the US News ranking and so forth. I'd say, work backwards. Think about what kinds of subjects are you interested in studying? What kind of fields are you interested in? What sorts of career opportunities are you interested in? And then work backwards from that. Figure out, okay, I'm interested in this career pathway. What is the best pathway to get me to that career? Okay, I'm interested in this field of study. Well, which college out there has the best program? Which college out there has the best outcomes for that particular field of study? And I think, policymakers need to internalize this as well. That when we're making accountability policy for colleges, for instance, that we really should be looking at the program level. That's why I was very excited as part of the recent One Big Beautiful Bill Act. There is a new standard that degree programs have to ensure that their graduates earn more than the typical high school graduate or a comparable high school graduate. And that test is applied at the program level. So your fine arts program might fail that test, but your engineering program might pass that test, or vice versa. And so the sanctions, which is loss of ability to use student loans, are also applied there at the program level. So I 100% agree that we absolutely need to, both when we're talking to students about different post-secondary options and when we're talking to policymakers about the best way to think about fixing higher education, the program level, looking at the program level really is paramount.
Let me just ask Preston to comment on something that was part of the One Big Beautiful Bill that might be relevant here. Workforce Pell. There are probably some people listening in who know what that is, others who don't, but maybe clue them in on what that's
Absolutely. Well, Bruno, you stole the question that I was going to ask Carlo because I was going to ask Carlo about Workforce Pell, but maybe Carlo will want to weigh in as well. So Workforce Pell grants, basically under previous law, before the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, if you wanted to get a Pell Grant, and that's the low-income students financial aid program for college, you had to be mostly attending traditional kind of college programs, at least, of a minimum duration. There were some trade schools that were eligible for Pell Grants, but, shorter term workforce education, that was not eligible for Pell Grants. That is now changed with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. They've created a program called Workforce Pell Grants, where programs between 8 and 15 weeks in length, or 150 to 600 clock hours, can now qualify for Pell Grants to help lower income students pay tuition to do these types of programs. There is a catch though. The programs have to meet outcome standards. Specifically, the boost in earnings that they provide to students has to be greater than the price of the program. So the programs have to meet this kind of minimum floor if they want to get access to Pell Grants, which I think is great because there are a lot of wonderful short-term workforce education programs out there that will help a lot of students. I'm glad they can get access to Pell Grants, but there's also a lot of not so great programs out there. Carlo mentioned the research that was done showing that there's huge variation in the outcomes of these shorter-term programs. And that's why, I was very eager to see that there was that there is that provision in there to ensure that workforce Pell programs are meeting this outcome standard. But I'm very excited. I think it could be very transformative for students who want to pursue one of these shorter term programs but haven't had the financial means to do so just yet. But I did want to, if you'll permit me, Bruno, I did want to, ask both Jenny and Carlo, how you both are thinking about workforce Pell, what kinds of opportunities it might create. Carlo, for the Launchpad jobs you mentioned, will workforce Pell help students access those jobs? Jenny, the students you work with, is workforce Pell something you're thinking about? I would love to hear, both of your perspectives on this new program.
Carlo, maybe have you go first.
Carlo, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, going back to the top of the conversation, right? Like, I think we want to make sure that people can invest in high quality training. How do you identify high quality training, right? That's the trick. That's the rub. How can we find a way to sort of understand where is the value being delivered here? How do you measure it? How do you standardize it, right? There are hundreds of thousands of credentials out there. And as we sort of think about Workforce Pell as a lever for bringing new programs on board, right, there's a lot of opportunity to develop new ways of training that are going to, again, be short form, but hard to measure, right? Not a lot of runway, not a lot of experience to look back and say, how do we capture value where we can't necessarily observe a runway of it? And it's going to be hard, right? Like I think there's, most people will tell you that there is a risk that, of bad actors in this space. I think, one of the things that the government has done, but that the sector itself has done, is gotten really good at policing itself and trying to make sure that what gets delivered gets delivered responsibly. I think the 1990s are over, right? And I think that as we sort of think about increasingly about tying education to workforce outcomes, we are building a new culture right now where I think no academic program, including those eventually that are going to start to evolve within the public and private not-for-profits in traditional areas, are going to be immune from thinking about workforce outcomes, right? And so Workforce Pell is a great example of a first place to start testing the waters of that. But it's going to be hard. And I think it's going to be difficult to think about how do we set the right kind of bar to evaluate whether any one of these programs is really delivering value. And there will probably be some slips and stutters and, along the way as we get our feet underneath this. But in the long run, I think this is a good practice.
Yeah, Jenny, do you?
Sure. I think I almost want to reorient the conversation a little bit, only in that I think that so much of what we're missing is the opportunity for the applied learning to happen to complement what is classroom learning. So the Workforce Pell can be very helpful because many of, for instance, the young people in DC need to be earning money, not just not spending money. Like, because they're a primary breadwinner in their family, or they're contributing. And so Workforce Pell is going to be helpful that they didn't have access to. But my bigger question, or my bigger is, how can we have more young people have more access to applied learning opportunities? And thus, I think the question is, how do we organize it for employers so we make it worth it for them? Because I'm not actually asking employers, will you just be really nice and just have lots of kids do internships and various other things? Like, we actually need to, and that's where, for me, the apprenticeship with a little a is so powerful, because in some ways it's really the length of time that an employer needs to both invest in you so that you know how to do things that actually take work off their plates. And then the length of time, if you shorten it too much, you don't get the benefit. So it's just this, it's like a teeter-totter in terms of the balance that we need to make. So I think that short-term, the Pell, a Workforce Pell can be helpful, but I think that I'm worried about this much bigger question, which is for those kids who have privilege, they've often managed to navigate what it means to have a work-based learning experience. But how do we make it so that for all of our public school students, and arguably even all of our students, there are really high quality applied learning opportunities that make it so that it's not just being the employer being nice, but it actually is part of a talent development pipeline. And that's, I think, the sort of the kicker in all of this.
Your turn to ask a question to one or both of the panelists, and then I have one final question to all three of you. Go ahead.
I don't know if I'm allowed to just turn the last thing that I said to you, Preston and Carlo. I think that I'd love to hear your take on applied learning and how, sort of framing that a little bit. I cannot tell you how many things I've learned from both of your institutions. Like I have pages and pages from Burning Glass. AEI is where I first met some folks from Switzerland, which turned me on to the possibilities of apprenticeship. So I'd love to hear your take on how are you thinking about this applied learning piece, and how critical it is to young people now because a degree isn't sufficient, but then how do we go about doing that?
I'd be glad to start. Yes, well, short answer is I'm in favor of applied learning. I agree with everything. I agree with everything you said. I think, from the federal policy perspective, what I'm most concerned with is the federal government putting its thumb on the scales in favor of one post-secondary pathway or another. And I think for a long time, that post-secondary pathway that the government has been putting its thumb on the scales in favor of is the traditional four-year pathway. And I think Workforce Pell is correcting that a little bit by also providing some support for these shorter-term pathways. But there's a lot that is still left out of Workforce Pell and the current ecosystem. I mean, for applied learning, generally for apprenticeships, big A or little a, apprenticeships, I mean, the funding that is available through federal sources is very limited. It's not guaranteed. There's all these hoops you have to jump through, which really contrasts with higher ed funding, which does operate a lot more like an entitlement that you're basically guaranteed to get that if you meet this this very basic set of conditions. So I'm interested from a federal policy perspective, not necessarily should we have a big new government program that's going to fund applied learning and apprenticeships, but how are there ways that we can take the money we are currently spending and put these different options on a bit more of a level playing field, whether that means using Pell Grants for related technical instruction, for instance, or potentially offering wage subsidies to people who are doing apprenticeships or internships to make that a little bit more palatable for employers to hire those folks. Those are some of the kind of playing field leveling options that I think it would be great for the policy conversation to move into going forward. But Carlo, I don't know what you think about all this.
I mean, it's hard to go last on something like this because all the good stuff's been said. But I will add as a coda to all of this, look, I mean, people go to college and people invest in education because they want careers, right? We invest in 6 weeks or 6 months or 6 years of training so that we can go do something that we love for a much longer period of time. And I think increasingly what we're observing is that even the most traditional disciplines have a very strong alignment to what you plan to do with that training afterwards. And so whether we talk about internships, whether we talk about apprenticeships, whether we talk about short-term programs, increasingly what we're talking about is figuring out a way to divorce ourselves from the traditional model of just educate first and then move into the workforce afterwards, and figuring out a way to blend these two does a much better job of recognizing the economic reality of most people, which is that it's really hard to take 6 months or a year or 2 years of your life off to train for something for a longer term outcome. We need to find a way to put those two pieces together. A lot of the things that we talk about in policy circles and in practice today seem to reflect this idea that increasingly education and work is something that blends together. And it also doesn't blend together at one point in time. We want people to be lifelong learners. We want people to go back and keep coming back and keep coming back. And I think that model makes more sense and will continue to make more sense to people as we sort of build new education policy over the next 20 to 30 years.
Yeah, one final question to everybody, and you get not quite a minute to answer the question. If you want to repeat something you've said, that's welcome. So if you could design a better first job market, what one, at most two things would you do to create that better first job market? I'm going to start in reverse order. Jenny, you were last, so why don't you go first here, then Preston, and then Carlo.
Sure. I think you won't be surprised, but I think that it's creating degreed apprenticeship degrees. It's this combination of learning while you're working, of having a positive return on investment for an employer, and having all of the, as Preston mentioned, the federal government supports college going at, I think, 1,000 times per dollar compared to a typical apprenticeship. But I think that for me, it's taking out the capital A apprenticeship in the sense of like the way that Americans often think about it. And it's like, how do we have a learn and earn pathway that is robust and allows for especially our young folks who need to be working while they're learning. So to me, that's not maybe exactly answering your question, but what I would do is create more degree apprenticeships, apprenticeship degrees, mush these two things together, and actually even mush high school, college, and early employment into, like, rehash it and then come up with a new way of organizing.
Now, Preston, get your quick.
Yeah, I think what I would most hope for is for employers to be a little bit less rigid in how they think about different credentials and different qualifications. I do think that despite the rise of the skills-based hiring movement, a lot of employers still do fall back on the bachelor's degree as a signal that they respond to when they're choosing who to hire. And I don't think that's adequate anymore. I think we do need to recognize this variety of pathways that is out there, and these individuals who may not necessarily have a traditional four-year degree, but do have a lot of great skills and experience from the alternative pathways they've taken through their post-secondary careers that could be just as relevant for the jobs that the employers are hiring for. So I would say think a little bit less about the degree and think a little bit more about the person.
Carlo, you get the last word here.
Yeah, last thing, and I know we're at time. I think if we want to set grads up for success in the job market, it needs to start earlier than a career services component that ends up being an afterthought at the end of the training program and needs to be embedded throughout the training program. The day you start working, or the day you start enrolling in education programs, you should be thinking about the career you're driving towards. You should be thinking about all the components you're aligning towards. You should be focused on the extent to which the classes you're taking and the skills you're learning align to what you're trying to achieve. We really need to break away from this idea of career services being this basement office with a dangling light bulb and really turn it into a robust investment within the architecture of the training program itself, so that all students are thinking about the career that they're going to leverage their education in afterwards from day one.
Okay, we've been talking about from classroom to career, the path to a first job with Jenny Niles, Preston Cooper, and Carlos Salerno. Thanks to you for being part of the panel, and thanks to our listeners.